my name is Dave Ford, and I am the founder of the OPLN. We're the OPLN team. You'll get to meet many of us today. We're just so excited to bring together such a diverse group across the stakeholder spectrum from so many different parts of this process. So just to give you a little overview, this is an interactive carbon neutral convening and capacity building program, which is developed in conjunction with the UN Plastics Treaty INC schedule. And the mission is to serve as an informal public forum for multi-stakeholder capacity building and knowledge sharing across member states, value chain actors, civil society, unrepresented groups, such as the underrepresented groups, such as the informal waste sector, to interact and prepare for technical discussions around the INCs. We aim to promote science and innovation and infuse data into this process, and to report on the UN Plastics Treaty evolution through the INC process. So just to give you a little background of how we've come to be, this is almost 3 years of programming that we've been running the Global Treaty Dialogues. Initially, it started out in partnership with World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace. We have been all over the world. We run 18 sessions. We've had over 1,000 attendees from every continent except Antarctica that we know. We're not sure, maybe someone from Antarctica has joined, and worked, across so many countries around the world. We've convened in Chile, in Malaysia, United States, in Pakistan, in Ghana, in Indonesia, and in the United Kingdom. And at this time, I also want to thank our supporting partners that make this possible. And they are, for this year's programming, SAP and Accenture. And we're so grateful to both of our supporting partners. SAP and Accenture share a commitment to a sustainable future through technology and human ingenuity. They're committed to delivering the digital solutions and innovation needed to enable the goals of this treaty at scale. And just a short disclaimer, supporting partners do not influence the Global Treaty Dialogues programming considerations, agenda, or participation framework. So once again, thank you so much to SAP and Accenture. So just to ground into some of the foundational things that have happened over the course of the last 2 years. So we got a mandate to start negotiations at UNEA 5.2, which was in March 2nd, 2022, over a year ago. And the member states agreed to start these negotiations via a legally binding framework to consider the full life cycle of plastics from source to sea, to promote the sustainable production of plastics, to acknowledge plastics' potential risks to human health, and to recognize the role of waste pickers and the informal workers in solving the plastic crisis. And we've come a long way in the last year and 4 months, and started a journey around the world. Many of you may have joined in Punta del Este for INC-1, which happened last November. And again, we're right on the tail of Paris, which happened a little less than 2 weeks ago. And we'll be in Nairobi in November for INC3, where we're going to have the zero draft, Canada, Republic of Korea, and then moving into the Conference of Plenipotentiaries in early 2025 as everything stays on schedule. So the roadmap is clear, and we're going to be going through today in depth a lot of the progress that happened, and just an overall digest of what happened at INC2. So again, at the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network, we are a neutral convener. We do not take advocacy positions, but what we do is bring groups from all across the spectrum together to learn to each other, bringing all sides of the crisis. And many of these different sides don't agree on exactly how to get things done. Now, that includes in the finance, ESG movement, research and academia, civil society, the waste management sector, the informal waste sector, local and small businesses, consumer goods companies, petrochemical companies, the agriculture sector, and manufacturers and producers, and many more groups from there. I want to quickly root into the work that we've been doing with DEFRA in the United Kingdom. We have been working with the United Kingdom for the better part of the last year ahead of INC1 and INC2 to help the stakeholders in their country understand where each other sit, and to help inform DEFRA so they can really understand how to come into these different INCs. And if you see in the chat right now, we shared our most recent INC-2 reports, just to give you a sense of some of the additional country work that we've been doing. At this point, I'm so excited to introduce Ms. Christina Dixon, who's been just an incredible supporter and really one of the leading voices on the Plastics Treaty. Chris couldn't be with us today, but she sent along a video that I think is going to be highly informative for everyone, and we're just very grateful for EIA and all the work that they do.
Hi, I'm Chris Dixon from EIA, and I am going to give you a short-ish recap of what happened at the second round of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC-2, in Paris, France, which took place earlier this month. So I'm just going to dive straight in. So I think you've seen this slide before, but basically this is a timeline of the negotiations as a whole. So we're on this kind of sprint to negotiate a new plastics treaty by the end of 2024. And shockingly, we are now approaching the mid-section of the negotiations. So we're nearly halfway there, guys, terrifying. And so we've had the first round in Uruguay, which was at the end of last year. We've just had Paris, and then later this year in November, which is now confirmed, we will be going to Nairobi for INC-3. So what happened at INC-2? There was a lot, but I'm just going to try and unpack it for you as best I can. So you might have seen in the news or on social media lots of images like this one. As it happened, we spent a lot of the meeting not even in formal session, but in these kind of informal huddles where countries were getting together in groups in the corner of the room in different permeations, trying to resolve topics before coming back and reporting back on the outcome of those informal discussions. And so these huddles were a very familiar sight during this week in Paris. The big topic that caused the most issues was around rules of procedure. So I think going into the meeting, a lot of people felt that these procedural issues might cause some contentious points in the negotiations, but I'm not sure anyone was expecting that it would get to day 3 near enough and we hadn't even talked about plastics yet. But that's what happened here. This issue of rules of procedure, without getting too into the kind of weeds of it, is about the issue of voting versus consensus. So whether or not countries should be able to vote on matters of substance, or whether it should always rely on consensus. The countries that would allow the provision of voting are not saying they're going to vote on everything, but just that if consensus can't be reached, the option to vote should be available. And they don't want to feel kind of held to ransom by 1 or 2 countries that can essentially exercise a veto to water down ambition. There's another group of countries that feel very strongly that there's a strong tradition of consensus-based decision-making, and that should be protected. This divergence in views essentially led to a kind of loggerheads, and actually agreement couldn't really be reached. So a temporary kind of placeholder was agreed late in the night on, I think it was Tuesday, to say, let's park this for now so that we can move on for matters of substance. But this issue of rules of procedure certainly hasn't gone away. And I think it's a really important one to watch going forward. You know, and from our perspective, the issue of voting is a really critical one to ensure that ambition can remain high. The other topic that got a lot of attention was around access. So as you might remember, about a week before the negotiations, there was this notice from the Secretariat that each organisation, the delegation of 5, would receive 1 floating badge to share between 5 people. This meant that a number of groups either didn't send representation last minute, or they did come to Paris at great expense, but still couldn't access the building. And this included, for example, Indigenous groups, fence line communities, and the academic scientific community, which is really unfortunate for meaningful participation in the negotiations. There was, on the other hand, quite a large industry presence at this round of negotiations. So what about the actual substance of the meeting? So we got to day 3 and finally we were allowed to talk about plastics. And what this meant was the meeting was broken out into 2 contact groups. So contact groups are not like the plenary when you're in the big room with all the kind of formal country badges laid out, but you're in kind of smaller, slightly more informal groups, which are more of a negotiation space. However, given the limited amount of time that was remaining after losing several days to the procedural issues, we basically raced through the two topics. The two topics that were being covered in each group was on core obligations and control measures, essentially the kind of what the agreement should do. Will it deal with plastic production? Will it deal with product design? How will it deal with waste management, etc.? So kind of going through these obligations and sort of doing a refining process based on what was presented in the options for elements document, which was the kind of formal document for negotiation at this meeting, and kind of emphasizing preference for different obligations over others. In the other group, they were talking about means of implementation and implementation measures. So things like national action plans, but also the kind of hot topic in that group was around financing. The interesting thing that kind of emerged from that group was a proposal from the Federated States of Micronesia and a number of other co-sponsors looking at a kind of dedicated multilateral fund or dedicated financial mechanism and putting forward an in-session document, which is available on the website where you can read what they're proposing. But the kind of conversation emerging in that group is really between the sort of donor countries and the developing countries about, what kind of financial mechanism do we want to implement the treaty, and who should pay for it and how. And that is definitely going to be an ongoing topic throughout the negotiations. In each group, there wasn't a lot of time for substantive negotiations. So really, it was a kind of exchange of views, but we didn't really get into the very strong kind of position setting that you might otherwise expect from a negotiation. So what comes next? Basically, an outcome of this meeting was a sort of process to take us forward to INC-3. So the first thing is that there'll be a kind of submissions process, similar to what we had in advance of INC-2. Countries and stakeholders are invited to make submissions on things that were not discussed at INC-2. So that includes the issue of principles and also scope of the instrument. And this was something that was pushed quite strongly by countries that felt like, we can talk about substance, but we also have to talk about some of the kind of overarching aspects of the agreement simultaneously. And we didn't get the chance to do that at INC-2. The other aspect that the submissions can be made on is around intersessional work. I think some people have been hoping to have a clearer plan for intersessional work that could be advanced now between INCs 2 and 3, but that's not really what happened. So this is an opportunity to put forward ideas for further intersessional work. And there were quite a number of ideas identified in the contact groups, and you can read those in the report of the contact groups that were prepared by the co-facilitators. So on this slide, I've just popped some kind of key deadlines. So maybe particularly of interest to everyone watching this is that the observer deadline is the 15th of August. So if you're planning to submit something on these topics, you'll need to be preparing that quite soon. On the principles and scope, the submissions from that will be synthesized into a report prepared by the Secretariat. And that will actually be mostly discussed the day before the INC. So there'll be a day in advance of the next INC, so a kind of additional day where that synthesis report will be dived into in a bit more detail. The other sort of key outcome, and this is the big one, I should have probably done a drum roll or something, but the big objective of this meeting was really to come out with the mandate for a zero draft for the treaty and to be drafted by the chair. And this is what we got. So in advance of INC-3, probably about 6 weeks before, we'll get a draft, a first look of the treaty. And so this will be the basis of the negotiations in INC-3. So that is very exciting. And that was a major outcome. So I think, reflecting back on the procedural issues and how the meeting went as a whole, I think actually, we should be really optimistic and positive about the outcomes because we did get this mandate for the zero draft. So there definitely is appetite to get the treaty process moving despite the delays. The Bureau was also elected. So this actually went to a vote at the meeting. And without going into the details, that also took a lot of time, but now that's been resolved. So at least the INC has a fully functioning Bureau to guide its work going forward. And also, and again, despite some controversy on this issue, there was agreement reached on the next locations of the INCs. So it's confirmed that we will be in Nairobi, Ottawa, and then in South Korea. So these issues were resolved at this meeting. So there were some concrete and positive outcomes wrapping it up. So that was my whistle stop recap of INC-2. And yeah, see you guys soon.
So again, we want to thank Chris Dixon and all the incredible work that EIA has been doing and the help and support that they've given us along the way. And Chris said would really have loved to be here in person, but we're just really appreciative that she was able to really outline what just happened. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce my partner and the CEO of the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network, Marta Lapata, who's going to introduce our the next piece of programming we have.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for joining us today. And we're here today with a group of member state representatives who will give us their insights specifically on their INC-2 submissions, but also the evolution of that in the context of zero draft and their potential recommendations for that. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I'll be happy to welcome today 4 representatives, including Dennis Clare, who is an INC-2 negotiator with Federated States of Micronesia. Mr. Dennis Clare, are you here with us?
I am.
Wonderful. And we also have with us today Mr. Gonzalo Guayaquil, head of Chilean negotiation. Mr. Gonzalo Guayaquil, are you here with us?
Hi, morning. Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful. And we also have with us today Madame Bassiana Tresor Avomoondo, head of the Regulations Department.
Hello, I'm here.
Hi, great to hear you. And we also have with us today, a last minute, but really glad that we managed to also introduce and move forward with a Malaysia representative, Mr. Mod Ridwan bin Ismail. Are you here with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning and evening from Malaysia.
Good morning and good evening. And on that note, I would love to hand it over to Mr. Dennis Clare. So just for all of us to understand the structure of today's discussion, we'll first start with 5-minute presentations from each of the member states representative included, and then we will follow to a Q&A section. We will have one presentation included on English translation. I will be providing a transcript in a link in the chat also in presentation. So we'll start now and move forward with Mr. Dennis Clare with Micronesia. Could you give us your concise summary of the INC-2 submission and also, if any, recommendations for the zero draft?
Hi, thank you, and good morning, everyone. I think it might be helpful if I give a little background actually as well, because we come from a very specific history that informs our interest in this treaty, in this process. I've spent the last 2 decades or so as a climate and ozone negotiator, and Micronesia has led the charge on the acceleration of the HCFC phase out in 2007 and on the HFC phase down under the Montreal Protocol that was agreed under the Kigali Amendment. So we're very interested in getting upstream to avoid the things that cause us problems later, downstream. And we've been successful with that under the Montreal Protocol. And we think a similar approach could work at several of the life cycle phases of plastics. Micronesia is a small country, if you look at it in terms of land, small island state, we're called. But if you look at it in terms of ocean, very large, with the 14th largest EEZ in the world. And much of the resources, the natural resources, the fish stocks come from that large ocean resource. So we want to protect that environment, as do all the other Pacific countries. Now, our view is pretty simple on the face down approach, is that if you have something that's man-made and you want to have less of it, that you make less of it. And that's our approach to HFCs, HCFCs, plastics, and other environmental man-made harms. Now, of course, what you have to do is you have to come up with alternatives, because you needed those things. You have to have them be safe. They have to be economically accessible, and they have to be available in all markets. So those things are very similar to what we've done under the Montreal Protocol, and we think that that will apply pretty similarly under certainly certain aspects of the plastics regime at the production stages. So that's been a large part of our interest, and then our submission going into INC-2 was pretty much informed by that. It was a broad submission that dealt with the different life cycle phases, but I'd say about half of our submission had to do with the funding of the work, 2 out of, say, 4 pages. Now that led to, at INC-2, a joint submission by Micronesia and 6 other countries across island states, Africa, and Latin America, to really sort of start to hone in on what the financial mechanism would look like. So we have our proposal going into INC-2, which was broader, and we have a group proposal with 7 countries that was made during INC-2 to look at what a financial mechanism would look like. And the reason I led with that big intro is because we've learned a lot of lessons from financing different types of environmental treaties, particularly those that involve phase downs and phase outs at various stages. And the Montreal Protocol has been by far the most successful environmental treaty, if not any kind of treaty. And a large part of the core of its success has been the multilateral fund, the financial mechanism. So the proposal that we did at INC-2 with 7 countries on the means of implementation, we think is just a core element of making this treaty work, no matter what the ultimate chosen actions and incentives coming out of the first contact group are. UNEP, for example, has done studies on why the Montreal Protocol is so successful. And the basic answer is that it funds the stuff that needs to be done. In other words, you kind of get what you pay for. So we hope and expect the funding for the actions under the treaty for developing countries, for eligible countries to receive funds, is robust. And we've very openly borrowed a model from the Montreal Protocol because it's successful in what that might look like. And at the same time, we recognize that that model won't cover everything, that we will probably need additional partnerships, potentially additional funds, potentially cooperative work with outside existing funds like the GEF. There are calls for privately funded funds to address very specific sectors or elements of the treaty. So we have a broad set of actions that might take place under the plastics regime, but we think that the core funding should be through a established financial mechanism under the regime that could be complemented by additional funds or existing funds that work on broader environmental problems or more specific aspects of the agreed activities under this treaty. I think our general view is that the process itself can start to drive change, can start to create those alternatives. Just by having the INC process, we're sending signals to industry that change is coming, that alternatives will be necessary, that costs should, should be low, that these new alternatives will be needed in all markets. But we definitely believe that you get what you pay for, and we think that that's been proven in other treaties. And then conversely, the treaties that do not have as much robust support either are not as effective in being implemented, or there are a lot more work to be done by the countries that need support, spending their resources going around and looking for that funding. So we think a core financial mechanism will be absolutely essential for the developing countries to undertake the work, both because the support for the actions needs to be robust, and because, to be honest, those countries don't have the resources to spend half their time looking for the resources and the other half the time trying to implement the treaty. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but the proposal is pretty short and available online. We think there needs to be a fund. There's rubrics for how the governance of the fund works, so that it would be balanced, so that there'd be regular contributions that would be then replenished on a regular basis. We have a whole bunch of details on governance and replenishment. A lot of those are borrowed from the Montreal Protocol, But as we start to think about all the different things that will be taking place under this treaty, we're strongly of the view that a core mechanism to fund those actions should reside within the treaty and be complemented by potentially outside funds or existing funds like the JEF to take on actions that are not covered under the fund. Now, a lot of this is still to be negotiated, what the rubrics for being a recipient country will be, what the rubrics for replenishment will be, but we find that this core mechanism model with balanced governance and regular replenishment is a core to any kind of robust, ambitious treaty action. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clare. And now moving on to Mr. Gonzalo Wakil. Mr. Wakil, could you tell us a little bit more specifically from like Chilean perspective? What do you see as the key priorities in the context of the INC-2 submission as a GRULAC group, but also from, like I said, the Chilean representative, and also any recommendations for the zero draft?
Thank you, Marta, and good morning again, and good evening to the colleagues that are in other part of the world. Yes, first of all, I must say that we are one of the countries that our colleague from Micronesia just mentioned. So we're one of the ones that are supporting this submission and the proposal. And even though we are not a small island developing state, we also are an oceanic country. Chile has the 11th largest exclusive economic zone in the world, and we have been quite engaged in different areas as the ocean and climate nexus, and also in the ocean protection. So for us, we see a close connection between the INC process to develop a plastic treaty, for example, with what is already happened this week also, which is the BVNJ treaty. So, and as Chile is host and bidding to host the Secretariat of BVNJ, we think there is a lot of complementarity between those processes and also in the climate process. So first of all, what I want to say is that we celebrate the results during the INC-2 because we all wanted to have a mandate for a draft text, and we got it. As the previous presenter said it, also there were some speed bumps on the road, but we managed to overcome the different challenges that are part of any multilateral process. These are complex times also, and we cannot forget that even we are talking about an environmental and economic issue, there is also a lot of geopolitics involved, as in any other international fora. But at the end of the day, this was a step that is key in response to the mandate generated by Resolution 514, and now it drives the process to another phase of negotiation when we are going to fully enter it to the basis of a text for a future agreement. So that means that now we have to move into more detail and dynamic of works and to show progress toward achieving this work. Nonetheless, we have some complex challenges ahead. As Chile, we acknowledge that the next phase is going to be more complex, especially during the intersessional period, when we said it before, we said it to the INC-2 in Paris, we need technical and political work to implement and to see the challenges that we're going to face before INC-3. And for that, science and policy and politics must be brought together. And we have to make sure that we need to consider the international debate of how to put the technical information on service for the countries. That's something that we were pushing a lot in Paris. Everybody that heard our interventions, they basically understood it, but we need to, and we think that we need to discuss like terminology and start defining concepts in order to move ahead. And for that reason, we, at one point, we were thinking a proposal to have informal working models on technical nature between INC-2 and INC-3. At the end of the day, we have to make a compromise, and we dropped that initiative on other members of GRULAC and members of especially developing countries. But we still think that we need to have these discussions, and we're trying right now to understand better how we can have that space for inputs from civil society and and also from the scientists in order to advance in this technical expertise. As for the principles that we need to start making sure that are in the treaty, we, as Chile, we advocate for an ambitious but yet realistic goals within this treaty. So that means that, same as our colleague from Micronesia said it before, we need to significantly reduce the production and consumption of single-use plastics, for example, and to start promoting right now sustainable alternatives, and also improve waste management systems. Those are key issues that needs to be faced, especially in developing countries, because if not, the treaty is not going to work as we want. Also, as we are really concerned what's happening in the ocean, also, the treaty must address the issue of microplastics and microfibers. That's something that for us is highly important because they pose significant threats to ecosystems and also to human health. And for that, we think that the circular economy approach is a way to manage the plastics. This, of course, includes prioritizing waste prevention, promoting recycling and upcycling, and encourage the design of more sustainable plastic products. And this transition towards a circular economy will not only reduce plastics waste, but also create economic opportunities and contribute to sustainable development. Chile was one of the countries also that during the negotiations in UNEA 5.2, we were pushing, for example, for language for the informal sector. And we think that the transition that the whole world is going to face in the next years cannot leave behind this important sector of the economy. They have to be taken into board, and that's why, as long with other countries in INC-2, we were quite vocal about this issue. As for the general principles, we support the polluter pay principle, the precautionary approach, the access to environment information were one of the signatures, and we promoted the Escazú agreement. So we will keep pushing for that we think is quite important in this treaty. As the environmental law, international environmental law is developing, we think that we cannot get stuck in the Rio Convention. We need to move forward, and this INC process could help us also to move the barrier a bit more into that direction. And of course, the just transition is must be ensured within the text of the agreement. And for that, we think that these principles provide a strong foundation for addressing the environmental challenge that we face today. As for capacity building and global cooperation, our colleague from Micronesia said that without the means of implementation will be quite difficult for the countries to transition. And we need to foster global cooperation and encourage capacity building, especially in developing countries. The support and assistance should strengthen their waste management infrastructure, for example. We need to develop recycling technologies, and we need to enhance public awareness and education about plastic pollution. And without the funding to do that, it will be quite difficult and challenging for many of the countries. We acknowledge, for example, that Chile has been in the lead in several areas, but still we face shortage in others. And there are many countries, especially in small developing islands, or for example, in Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia, that they will need even more support. So in order to have an effective treaty, we must ensure that we have an effective system. And we need to learn also from past mistakes. There are other MEAs that have showed that there are some good, we can get good results, and other ones that the results are not that good. So we will, in that case, we support the idea of Micronesia, and that's why we are on board, and we will try to engage with many countries in this endeavor. As for the inclusiveness and stakeholder engagement, again, I cannot emphasize the importance that we have to have in this engagement in the developing and implementation of the treaty. What happened in Paris was regrettable, and I think everybody involved in the process sent a strong signal to the Secretariat from the beginning that cannot happen again. And the next host of the INC process must ensure the effective participation of all the stakeholders that want to be involved in the process. And since like access is the minimum barrier that cannot happen again. So civil societies, local communities should be actively involved, and also the scientific community, as their expertise and perspectives are crucial for the successful of this global endeavor. So for us, at least for the Chilean side, we will attend the upcoming INC-3 in Nairobi with the intention to move forward and work constructively with all delegations. Again, we will highlight the need for a robust protection of the marine environment within the agreement. We think that the elements paper lacked a little bit of that area, and we try to push that really a lot during INC-2, and we think that the message was heard. So in the coming weeks, we will work also on a submission from Chile in order to like promote further that area. And furthermore, we will emphasize the importance of taking multilateral actions to address the triple environment crisis. I mean, there is all connection between climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution, especially plastic pollution. So in conclusion, we stand ready to contribute to the negotiations and to collaborate with nations and other stakeholders to develop a robust and effective plastic treaty. We must act urgently, and I think everybody that was in Paris got that message also, to collectively address plastic pollution and safeguard the health of our planet. Because at the end of the day, we can make a significant difference and ensure a sustainable future for generations to come. And for that, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention. And we look forward to a productive discussions and fruitful outcomes in this journey towards to get a plastic treaty. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gonzalo Guahi. In the chat right now, you'll be able to find two versions of report that OPLN has produced for Chile, in fact, but while hosting a series of multi-stakeholder engagement in 2022 ahead of INC-1. So for those interested to have a look at that, that's available for you. And in the meantime, we also ask you for any questions that you might have for Mr. Wakil to share them in your chat so we can address them later. Thank you so much again. And on that note, we'll be moving to our next member state representative, Madame Vasiana Trezo Avomo-Ondo. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
And Madame Vasiana will present in French, and we have a translation ready for all of you. And I will also read out the statement afterwards. So please, I give it to you, Madame Vasiana.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde et merci pour l'invitation. Alors, je vais commencer mon propos en disant que je suis vraiment un peu embêtée par le fait qu'il n'y ait pas de traduction parce que je suis sûre que j'ai perdu beaucoup d'informations pertinentes dans les présentations qui ont précédé la mienne. J'espère qu'on pourra travailler différemment pour les prochaines interventions. Pour en venir directement à la mienne, permettez que je vous parle d'abord de mon pays. Je ne sais pas combien d'entre vous le connaissent vraiment. C'est un pays au centre de l'Afrique et on a 800 km de côte. Il est très beau, mon pays. Donc, on a de belles plages. On a un important réseau hydrographique malgré un très grand couvert forestier. Et on va donc être particulièrement impacté par la pollution plastique puisqu'on la retrouve dans nos océans. Nous vendons beaucoup la destination Gabon parce que nous avons une politique qui met un important effort sur la préservation de la biodiversité et on s'implique beaucoup au niveau national sur la protection de l'environnement. Et donc, la question de la pollution plastique va justifier, va avoir un impact particulier pour nous. On a par exemple des aires protégées marines, on a des aires protégées, on a des pontes de tortues sur nos côtes. Et tous ces éléments-là vont justifier la position que nous avons prise dans notre soumission nationale. Déjà, dans la définition de l'objectif, on a pris un objectif qui a été très global, aligné directement sur la résolution en demandant que l'objectif soit un objectif qui va entraîner une protection de la santé humaine, une protection de la biodiversité et une protection des systèmes climatiques une protection des systèmes climatiques en permettant, en intervenant sur l'ensemble du cycle des plastiques. Il faut préciser aussi que le Gabon n'est pas véritablement producteur des polymères, le Gabon en hérite. Et donc, on a demandé qu'il y ait des principes dans le document, la convention qui va être adoptée, des principes comme celui de la responsabilité élargie des producteurs, qui produisent, qui donc qui vont avoir une responsabilité qui va être différenciée de celle de ceux qui vont subir la pollution. Et donc, il faut qu'il y ait cette responsabilité-là qui soit distinguée. Donc, il faut que les principes soient mis en avance. Parmi ces principes, on a insisté sur celui de la simplification chimique et sur celui de la non-régression, parce qu'il ne faudrait pas que lorsqu'on fasse des avancées, qu'on puisse ensuite revenir dessus. On a pu l'observer sur certaines autres conventions. Alors, sur les propositions par rapport pour les propositions concernant les obligations à proprement parler qui vont être dans la convention ou dans l'instrument qui est en négociation, globalement, ce que nous, on voudrait, c'est qu'il y ait des conventions, des obligations qui s'appliquent au niveau global. Si on n'a pas de contraintes au niveau global, on aura difficilement un suivi uniforme du problème et je pense qu'on pourra avoir beaucoup de mal finalement à le résoudre comme on voudrait atteindre les objectifs qu'on veut se fixer. Comme je l'ai dit, ça a été dit dans ma présentation, je suis juriste dans mon département et donc sans forcément m'impliquer dans les négociations sur les différents traités en cours, parce que j'ai l'obligation d'internaliser ces textes-là dans mon pays, je suis amenée souvent à regarder comment ça fonctionne. Et je peux voir par exemple que on a pour le protocole de Montréal une obligation qui s'impose à tout le monde et qui est assortie de calendrier et qui oblige tout le monde à s'impliquer finalement puisque c'est des objectifs qui sont fixés. Et voilà le genre d'objectifs qu'on voudrait voir intégrés dans le traité que nous sommes en train de négocier sur les plastiques. On voudrait aussi qu'il y ait, j'ai parlé d'échéanciers précis, on voudrait qu'il y ait aussi, pour la mise en œuvre, pour passer à la mise en œuvre, qu'il y ait un mélange. Déjà qu'il y ait qu'on mette des obligations d'information dans le traité et pour la mise en œuvre qu'on ait déjà des exigences qui vont s'appliquer à tout le monde. On a, dans le cas de la négociation sur les changements climatiques, le cas des contributions déterminées au niveau des parties. Je pense que s'il n'y avait pas cette obligation qui était mise en amont dans l'instrument global, les pays ne se sentiraient pas obligés de le faire. Et donc, si on doit mettre en place, qu'on mette en place une obligation nationale dans la convention et qui soit traduite au niveau régional et au niveau local. Et donc, si on doit faire des rapports nationaux, que ces rapports nationaux soient faits parce qu'il y a une exigence qu'ils demandent au niveau global. Et donc, pour résumer un peu, voilà ce que nous, on voudrait voir. On voudrait qu'il y ait aussi une obligation pour l'avenir. Quels sont les éléments qui vont le plus compter pour nous? C'est la transparence. La transparence, on voudrait qu'il y ait une obligation d'information quand on produit quand on va pour les plastiques qui vont continuer à être produits parce qu'on va pas tout de suite interdire la production plastique, mais que ce soit une production qui va faciliter la circularité. Et donc, on voudrait avoir mis en circulation des produits qui contiennent moins d'additifs. Et donc, il faut qu'il y ait une obligation d'information. Quels sont les polymères qui ont été utilisés au départ, quels sont les additifs qui ont été utilisés. Il faudrait, par exemple, que dans les différents produits, par exemple, le cosmétique, on sache qu'il existe des plastiques dans ces cosmétiques-là. Si on a cette obligation de transparence ajoutée à l'obligation de traçabilité, c'est-à-dire que si on retrouve un plastique à tel endroit, qu'on puisse savoir exactement d'où est-ce qu'il provient et comment est-ce qu'il a circulé, on peut avoir un meilleur contrôle de tout le processus. Et donc, pour résumer un peu, voilà ce qui a été pour nous les principales exigences qu'on a mis dans notre soumission écrite nationale et quelles sont les attentes qu'on va avoir pour l'INC-2. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Vassiana. And I will translate very quickly on some of the keynotes from Madame Vassiana, as you also have the transcript in the chat. So number one, Madame Vassiana have mentioned on multiple times that this agreement must be global and must be legally, globally binding. And without that element, it will not ever work. Number two, outside of the transcript that you can access, she's also mentioned specifically Montreal Protocol and the reference of that as a global agreement, and that really being truly how we should think moving forward. In terms of future phases and expectation, Madame Vassiana has highlighted as well the very specific concern around transparency and traceability, and she has given specific example of a sachet, which are manufactured and sold also in Gabon, and mentioned that as an example of an issue or use case product that needs a deeper attention as far as traceability and transparency goes for producers. And on that note, thank you again so much for joining us, and we are hoping that for future event, we'll be able to provide translations for the entire event, not only for the section of that. So I apologize that we are not able to do that today, but I'm hoping that we got the message across. And on that note, we will move forward to our last member state representative today. That's a representative of Malaysia, Mr. Maud Ridwan bin Ismail.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. To start with, all plastics are not the same and therefore should not be treated as so. I want to echo our colleague from Chile that we should focus on reducing unnecessary and problematic plastics and explore smart, safe, and sustainable ways to use plastics without hampering the economic benefits of plastics. Malaysia calls for the instrument to include the elements of potential economic benefits in ending plastic pollution. We should not generalize control on the use of plastic and its component unless they have been officially sanctioned and scientifically proven to be hazardous or carcinogenic. So our discussion should always be based on science and scientific data. Malaysia recognized the urgent need to address plastic pollution, including in the marine environment at the global level. Malaysia stresses the importance of addressing country capacities and readiness to implement a global agreement to end plastic pollution. Malaysia also notes that plastic pollution is primarily caused by the mismanagement and improper disposal of plastic waste. As such, we highlight the need to enhance waste management practices as a key approach to tackle plastic pollution. This provides a good foundation to set the objective of this instrument as follows: to end plastic pollution with a view to protect the environment and human health through the promotion of a safe circular economy for plastics, as well as through the promotion of environmentally sustainable plastic waste management and sustainable development. Malaysia also opines that no specific target date should be included in the objective to ensure the long-term relevance and validity of the instrument, allowing it to adapt to future circumstances. Malaysia underscores the complexity of the plastic pollution challenge. Key lessons from our experience include the importance of adopting science-based approach and prioritizing practical and scalable actions that deliver real impact on the ground. Malaysia emphasized the need to leverage existing mechanisms to coordinate action and support countries to implement global goals in line with regional frameworks and national priorities. Okay, some key priorities for consideration in an international instrument include, first, a whole life cycle approach to prevent and reduce plastic pollution while acknowledging the useful role that plastics play in our society. Second, fostering the sustainable use of plastic and improving waste management to address realities on the ground through a full life cycle approach. Third, encouraging the adoption of safe, sustainable, and economically viable alternatives and substitutes to traditional plastics to achieve net environmental benefit without problem shifting or inadvertently leading to harmful environment outcomes, ensuring reasonable transition timelines to ensure effective implementation of the instrument. Fourth, aligning reporting processes across frameworks and mechanisms to promote transparency and ease of reporting on progress and challenges. And fifth, harmonizing monitoring and assessment is crucial for comparable and transparent data to inform evidence-based action. Okay, some remarks on the zero draft text. Developing an ambitious yet practical instrument calls for an honest, transparent, open, and inclusive negotiation sessions so that no country is left behind. The success of establishing the zero draft legal text depends highly on the inclusiveness and flexibility of the negotiations. Options for inclusion in a global agreement should not be prescriptive and must consider realities on the ground, such as informal waste management structures and the need for affordable and accessible solution. As the conclusion, given that the majority of us are developing nations, it is crucial to offer timely and appropriate and adequate financial and technical assistance in accordance to the principles of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development to address the challenges in managing plastic pollution. Malaysia urged promoting a positive narrative that recognizes efforts and initiatives of countries as well as existing mechanisms for coordination. Malaysia encouraged providing capacity support for meaningful participation of countries with limited resources and capacity in the INC process to ensure that all voices are heard for an inclusive and effective agreement. And last but not least, we reiterate the support for the INC process and commitment to work with all countries and regions towards a clear, focused, and a pragmatic agreement that tackles plastic pollution. With that, I conclude my statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ismail, and thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your insights specifically about your country positions and about your group positions today. Considering a time, we would like to move the Q&A to the chat, meaning if there are specific questions addressing the member states, we'll appreciate all of you engaging in the chat. And if translation from the chat is needed, you can contact me directly, as I will be in assistance now. And we're going to be moving to our next section of today, engaging our stakeholder groups in discussion. And we're going to have our slides up shortly with the next group of speakers of today. And I'm going to hand it over to our moderator and executive director of OPLN, Heather Hogan, who will moderate this group of great speakers.
Great. Thank you so much, Marta. I'm really pleased to have the honor today to share with you 4 speakers providing a really diverse perspective on key issues to the plastic pollution issue, to help us kind of ground on different aspects from business, from chemicals and human health, from the marine environment and ghost gear, and then also from an environmental justice and marginalized and traditional community perspective. So with that, I'd like to welcome Alison Lin, who's the Global Vice President for Packaging Sustainability for Mars Inc., as well as Narayan Ashta, who is a PhD candidate with ETH Zurich and EMPA, the Swiss Federal Laboratories for Materials, Science and Technology. Hannah Pragnell-Roche, who is a policy specialist with the Global Ghost Gear Initiative and Ocean Conservancy, and Ms. Jo Banner, who's the co-founder and co-director of the Descendants Project. So with that, first I'll call on Ms. Alison Lin, who's the Global Vice President of Packaging and Sustainability of Mars Inc., where she leads the cross-segment strategy to improve the sustainability impact of Mars packaging. She was previously the SVP of Sustainability and Market Development at Westphal Technique, and has spent the majority of her career driving sustainability at brand owners such as P&G, Starbucks, and Coca-Cola, launching multiple projects to move packaging to more recyclable formats or utilizing higher levels of recycled content. She has been in multiple commitments and organizations across sustainable packaging industry, including SPC, APR, EMF, Advisory Board, CGF, Healthcare, Plastics Recycling Council, and many others. She has a BS in Business Administration from Carnegie Mellon University and an MBA from the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. Wow, Ms. Lin, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks to OPON for having me. And next time I'll send a much shorter intro. So sorry to everybody for that one. I also have been very excited to learn from the other speakers so far about the different positions that they've submitted, and you know, seeing the other speakers on this agenda, also very excited to learn from the rest of them. So I'm here both on behalf of Mars as well as the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty. If we can go to the next slide, please. So why are we calling for why is business calling for a plastics treaty? Many of the regulators were surprised that businesses actually wanted more regulation. And I want to emphasize that we are calling for more harmonized regulation so that those of us who are already doing many voluntary initiatives can accelerate that action with more certainty and reduce both complexity and risk. It's very difficult to accelerate, you know, massive redesign efforts when we're not sure of the regulatory environment that we're going to be playing in, as well as to have a common holy grail that we can march towards as we look at the future infrastructure. So we are calling for more regulation. We are calling for an ambitious treaty that can help us plan our investments, accelerate our investments, and give more transparency throughout the whole value chain. Go to the next slide. Who are the Business Coalition? So it's over 100 different companies, and I'll give a short representation in a bit so you can see who's in the spirit of full transparency, who are again calling for ambitious and effective global treaty that creates the right international policy and framework. We are looking for a legally binding treaty, and three of the key things, very similar to what some of the previous speakers have talked about already, is first, we're looking at reduction. What do we not need, especially focusing on problematic materials? And then circulation of what do we still need? So let's make sure that for the plastics that we do need for very many reasons, those are circulated appropriately. And lastly, prevention alongside remediation. So appreciate the call outs for microplastics and macroplastics in the environment, and how do we prevent and remediate those? We go to the next slide. Here's a short representation of who is in the Business Coalition. And I do also want to emphasize that, you know, as we look at reduction, prevention, circulation, and prevention, we're also looking at a just transition, which is personally very important to me. And as we look at some of the NGOs involved in the Business Coalition, I'm very excited that they are participating to lend their voices for some of those who are working with the informal sector, so we can better understand what a just transition actually looks like for those involved. We also have representatives from both consumer product goods, healthcare, fashion, durable goods. So it's a very broad representation, as well as financial institutions. There was discussion early on how do we fund this. So looking to some of the experts in the financial institutions to look at funding mechanisms and financial mechanisms, as well as different other players like converters, producers, and waste management and recyclers who are playing in the value chain. I did scroll through the list of folks participating, and I noticed that many of the folks aren't in the Business Coalition. So if we go to the very last slide, you're encouraged to, I do encourage folks to join so that you can have your voice heard and have a very real impact towards the Plastics Treaty. I was personally surprised at how many times both us as well as the other observers, NGO community and whatnot were asked to participate throughout the Plastics Treaty. It was a really amazing experience to be able to do that and to hear from the other voices in the room, in the plenary sessions and directly with the delegates. So definitely encourage more companies to join and have a real impact on something that, if you're using plastics, this is going to impact you in a big way. So might as well have your voice heard as part of the process. And with that, thank you again for having me here.
Great, Allison, thank you so much. Next, I would like to call on Narayan Ashta, who is a PhD candidate at ETH Zurich. He's an early career researcher, and he is currently working on the analysis of microplastics in the environment. He has previously worked on issues of persistent organic pollutants and plastics, together with the Global Environment Facility, UN Environment, and the Swiss government. His work with the Swiss government contributed to the recent listing of the plastic additive UV328 as a persistent organic pollutant under the Stockholm Convention, and he is one of the co-authors of the recent UNEP report, Chemicals and Plastics, which is, we'll be dropping it in the link. So really quickly, as I call on Narayan, I just want to remind everyone, please provide any questions or comments that you may have in the chat box. And then I also call on the speakers, if you'll help to monitor the chat box and respond to anything coming to you. So thanks. With that, Narayan, over to you.
Thanks, Heather, for the kind introduction, and greetings, everyone. I think it's really cool that we can meet like this and coming from different perspectives to discuss an issue that affects all of us as a global community. I'll be speaking mostly from the perspective of scientists that are concerned about the chemicals in plastics. Yeah, I didn't actually attend INC in person, not because of the overcapacity of the building, but just because research.
Oh no, I think Narayan's frozen.
One of these main documents, the INC-2/4, which is possible options for elements on tackling plastic pollution. And there's explicit mention of regulating chemicals of concern, as well as increasing transparency throughout the supply chain. So understanding what chemicals are used where and having that information available probably to businesses and consumers, but also eventually to the waste management sector, which is crucial. Next slide, please. Yes. So the reason I'm particularly happy about this is that I did contribute to the report that was recently published on chemicals and plastics. It's also available as one of the INF documents or additional information documents of the INC process, and it covers several aspects related to the chemicals in plastics. There are 7 chapters. One's an introduction, and the first 3 chapters deal with kind of what the problem is, what kind of chemicals we are concerned about, what kind of sectors they might be found in, what we know about the health effects or the environmental fate of these chemicals, and the issues related to the way we do chemical risk assessments and how these chemicals of concern have kind of slipped through the system, and how behind we are on being able to control these issues. But later in the report, we also describe possible ways forward and how to address chemicals of concern and potentially substitute them or even avoid them, and how to address chemicals in existing plastic waste streams so as also not to contaminate new products that are made from recycled materials, as well as in the context of a circular economy. So I will briefly describe some aspects of the report. Next slide, please. Yes, and considering that we are talking about a global agreement on plastics, I think it's super important that we discuss what plastics are made of. And if you look to the top left, you will see that basically plastic materials are a mixture of different components. Usually the bulk is a polymer, but you usually add several additives to give the polymer the desired properties, from fire resistance or being elastic or like stretchy or really durable and hard, or giving color to it. You have to use a variety of chemicals. And from our report, we've identified basically over 10,000 chemicals that are used in the plastic sector. We know a bit about half of them. And so for half of the chemicals, we have very little information. And for a quarter of these chemicals, so about 3,000 plus chemicals, have some kind of hazardous properties that we're concerned about. And in the report, you will find a list of 10 groups of substances that we consider chemicals of concern, and 10 sectors that contain these chemicals somehow in the plastics that are used in these sectors. And it goes beyond all the fast-moving consumer goods that usually are associated with plastic pollution. They include plastics or, for example, flame retardants used in cars or in buildings. These are long-term applications, but the chemicals can be released slowly from these plastic materials and leading to long-term exposure in humans and in the environment as well. So yeah, the report tries to move away from the paradigm that it's just plastic waste that is the problem, but rather really the design, the core materials, the chemistry of plastics can be problematic as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, and coming to the effects, exposure and effects of chemicals, you can look at the picture in detail if you take a look at the report. But basically, we know for a long time, and I think one of the speakers later on will also talk about this a bit. But the people working in plastic manufacturing plants have historically been shown to have higher cancer levels because they're exposed to hazardous monomers used to produce plastics. Including communities living around these factories. And what we also describe in the report are that there's increasing evidence that the additives contained in plastics, one, they can be released from plastics over time, even during use of plastic products, and also at the end of life. And so, yeah, that can lead to exposures of humans and ecosystems to a huge variety of chemicals. Next slide, please. So yeah, basically what we would like to see, or what I would like to see, is that the aspect of chemicals be addressed in the zero draft text. We know that it can impact the environment and human health, but also hampers the safe recycling of plastics, which again hampers a circular economy of plastics. And as I mentioned earlier, I've seen that some of these elements are described already in the possible options, and that's good. But we should also really focus on making them more binding approaches, or legally binding rather than voluntary, because voluntary is the way we do business now, and we don't really need a global agreement to continue doing things voluntarily. And although transparency is described in this elements document, I would like to reiterate that this is super important, that information on which chemicals are used in which products be transferred across the supply chain, all the way to the end where the waste managers have to deal with these chemical mixtures. And speaking of chemical mixtures, we need to also consider additionally, which is not being described in this options document, really consider reducing chemical complexity. And I think the PET industry, with the PET bottles industry, has kind of a harmonized list of additives that can be used, or some guiding principles, and maybe that can be used as a model for other polymer types. So yeah, that's all from my side. happy to have further discussion in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Narayan. And also thanks very much for pointing to that best practice in PET around chemical complexity. I haven't heard that before, so it's really good to know we've got at least a starting point. And also huge congratulations to your team for putting together the technical report, because it's a really significant body of work. So with that, I'd like to invite Ms. Hannah Pragnell-Rush, the policy specialist with Global Ghost Gear Initiative at the Ocean Conservancy. As policy specialist, Hannah provides expertise for GGI's policy and advocacy work, including working with government members on their national and international policies for managing fishing gear, leading government roundtables and providing recommendations on various policy interventions, such as the International Legally Binding Instrument for Plastic Pollution. She also leads a number of GGI's signature projects and is responsible for the development of a number of technical reports and knowledge products, which will be dropping in the chat box. You can monitor them there. With that, Hannah, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you OPLN for the invitation to speak today and bringing all these brilliant speakers together. It's great to have this forum to discuss such an important topic, obviously. So without further ado, if you could skip, thank you. The Global Ghost Gear Initiative, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a cross-sectoral alliance managed by Ocean Conservancy and is purely dedicated to the management of abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear, also referred to as ALDFG or ghost gear. So the Triple GI brings together NGOs, fishing industry, private sector, academia, and governments to build evidence, define best practice, and inform policy, and also catalyze and replicate solutions to prevent, mitigate, and remediate the impact of ALDFG in wild capture fisheries and also aquaculture systems. With that, we have over 20 member governments now, some of you that I've seen on the line, so it's great to see some familiar faces and familiar names. Next slide, please. So in terms of the ILBI, Ocean Conservancy's broader priorities for inclusion in the ILBI are around provisions for microplastics, having a meaningful source reduction of plastics, provisions around ghost gear, which I'll be focusing on here, design for circularity, and also inclusion of informal waste sector collectors. So marine plastic pollution obviously is an issue that is impacting the ocean and our coastlines, the world round, really. So as most fishing gear is made up of plastic, ALDFG is a major source of ocean plastic pollution, including the proliferation of microplastics, and has implications for global food security, biodiversity, coastal economies, human health and livelihoods, and has a disproportionate impact on small island developing states. Being that it is purposefully designed to catch aquatic species, ALDFG is pound for pound the most harmful form of marine plastic pollution, with significant ecological and socio-economic impacts, which are accumulative and felt globally. Plastic pollution from fishing and aquaculture gear is therefore a global issue that should be met through a coordinated global effort. As such, we published this report ahead of INC-2 to provide the background information as to the impact of fishing gear as a distinct source of marine plastic pollution and the rationale for why ALDFG should be considered within the ILBI. And it also includes a series of recommendations for voluntary and mandatory measures that could be implemented within the ILBI, and was also developed with a call from our member governments to provide that additional information and support as to why this particular form of marine plastic pollution should be specifically recognized in the ILBI. So like microplastics, ARDFG is a distinct and unique form of marine plastic pollution with causes, impacts, and potential solutions being significantly different from other forms of plastic debris and which vary substantially by local and regional context. We therefore feel that this warrants the inclusion of an additional core obligation in the ILBI that focuses specifically on the reduction of ALDFG in wild capture fisheries and aquaculture with specific measures across the full life cycle for its prevention, mitigation and remediation. We feel that the proposed measures in the option documents are inadequate to holistically address this pervasive and unique form of marine plastic pollution. And during INC-2, to this effect, we gave an intervention from the floor with the support from AOSIS, GRULAC and Chile specifically. So we thank you for the support there in ensuring that addressing sea-based sources of plastic pollution such as abandoned, lost or otherwise discarded fishing gear is critical to building a truly robust instrument. And we'd like to thank, obviously we got Chile on the line, so another special thanks for the leadership in ocean pollution and ensuring that the marine environment remains front and center through these discussions. I think during INC1, the marine environment lost a little bit of position within the discussion. So it's great to have the marine environment back at the forefront and have oceans considered, obviously, during these discussions. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps and moving forward, between what we saw obviously in the options paper, what came out of the contact groups and what will feed into the zero draft, we need to see upstream, midstream and downstream measures are essential, particularly if the ILBI is going to fulfill the mandate of addressing the full life cycle of plastics. Of course, there wasn't a specific mandate around intersessional work, so it's going to be imperative that this intersessional period does have some coordinated effort around the different issues and what the zero draft could include, and also continue dialogue, obviously, with member states as observers. We haven't got, direct impact into the actual zero draft, so a lot of our work will be obviously continuing to support our member states as these negotiations continue, and hoping to see that it's reflected in the zero draft. And thank you.
Great, Hannah, thank you so much for that. And maybe just one thing you could reflect on in the chat that really surprised me about the technical report that you guys put out recently was this cited figure that 46, I think, to 84% of ocean plastic, macroplastic by weight, is expected to be ghost gear, which was really surprising for me because we always say, 80% of ocean plastic comes from land sources. So maybe if you would reflect on that in the chat, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
And thank you so much for that. And now I'd like to call on our final speaker, Ms. Jo Banner, who is the co-founder and co-director of the Descendants Project. As a descendant of African slaves and a resident of Louisiana's Cancer Alley, Jo Banner's experiences firsthand the connections between plantations, petrochemical companies, and the damaging impacts of plastic production. From DC to Geneva, as well as many other places, Jo uses this experience to advocate for the protection of communities such as hers from harmful industries and practices that put people over profit. Really powerful. Jo, thanks so much for joining us. Over to you.
Good morning. Well, good morning from where I am in Louisiana. And thank you once again for the opportunity to be in this conversation with you all today. I want to say that it's really, I never imagined that I would be involved in the treaty talks, but I'm happy that I'm able to be participating in this event It can be intimidating. I'm not going to lie, as a frontline community member, especially when I have so many, we're around so many people, so many amazing researchers and scientists who can present incredible information, like actually Mr. Narain Ashton just presented. But what I think what we try to bring to these talks is really the voice from the front line. And I like to speak as a community member who's facing these problems. So we do speak a bit plainly, I do, but it's really because we're trying to just get the message that this problem of plastic is really impacting communities like mine. Walking into the proceedings and walking into the negotiations, I'm a little bit shocked, honestly, to hear how plastic is framed. Because imagine the fact that there is a treaty to resolve a problem like plastic pollution shows that it's a pretty serious problem. But I often hear the problem is being framed, well, but plastic is needed and plastic is amazing. And I think about, or for me, or even for you, if you can imagine that your house is on fire, God forbid, you call a firefighter to your home. And before the firefighter actually puts out your fire, the firefighter tells you, well, fire can actually be good. Fire provides heat, fire provides light, fire provides a means for you to cook. And also, I also am employed because of fire. So instead, the firefighter just sits there and your house is still burning. While yes, all those good things may happen from fire, but when it's your house that's on fire, guess what? You want the fire out. You want that firefighter to do the process of that. So that's where we are right now, okay? We need help, we need intervention because of the issues that we're facing from the production of plastic. And but that being said, being in Louisiana, being from St. John the Baptist Parish, which is in the middle of the area known as Cancer Alley, we cannot deny the impacts from plantations to petrochemicals to plastic as well. Where we are right now. This one shows every little square, every highlighted area is a indication of a plantation in Louisiana. So all those little slivers represent different plantations from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, which is essentially within Cancer Alley. Right now, and I'm sorry, I had a slide in there that showed you a lot of the petrochemical plants that we have now are actually on the grounds of former plantations. And if you can go to the next slide. The reason why this is occurring is because the plantations provided large acreage of land. And the land is also close to the river, on the Mississippi River. So you need that water source. And then you have a government in Louisiana that accommodates a lot of these industries, gives them incentives. The permitting laws are lax and the polluting laws are lax. So you have the perfect environment for these petrochemical plants to come in. And as the plantation or land-owning families sold their land to these petrochemical companies and made millions in outturns, is the descendants of the enslaved who were around these properties. Because remember, these people were kidnapped from Africa, brought to the country and forced to labor on these plantations. After they were emancipated or after they fought for the Union in the Civil War, these communities were actually settled around plantations called free towns. My community of Wallace is a free town that was started by Black Union soldiers. So you have these pockets of descendants who are now literally on the fence line of plantations or on petrochemical companies. And the image that I have here is a plantation home, San Francisco plantation, and behind it you can see the refinery that sits behind it. This is very common in Louisiana. If you can go to the next slide. So these plantations, these petrochemicals, but the plantations, if you think about the enslaved Africans who were on it, were also the burial sites for the enslaved. Remember, these people, the enslaved, had no place to bury their dead. So what they had to do was put the burial grounds were on the plantation grounds because they had no choice. Wherever there was a plantation, that was the burial ground of the enslaved. So now what you have in these petrochemical companies and their locations, they're also finding, as in the slide that I have here, grave sites for the enslaved, because every plantation would have had at least one burial ground for the enslaved. So I am making this connection to show what we as a frontline community are facing with our culture, with the harms, and all of this is happening. And this is happening in the production of plastic. This is an international business. Our port, the Port of South Louisiana, is the largest tonnage port in the Western Hemisphere. And one of their main exports is petrochemicals that's going all around the world. So all those happening in my community in Louisiana and in the river parishes of Louisiana and Cancer Alley, this is a global reach to what's happening right here. And if you can, this is in Louisiana, the cancer risk in my area percentile, we are at the highest in the country at 95th percentile of risk. We also have double the average rate in cancer cases. And it's because of, look at where we're located. Out of the 150 plants that we have within our area, about 140 of them are involved in the production of plastic. You can see from this, this graph that was created. Next, please. Well, if you would go back one more, it's just to show you that this is what's happening. These are the cemeteries that we have here in Louisiana. One is in St. John Parish, which is where I live. One is in St. James and one is in St. Charles. And if you can see behind it, you see the infrastructure of the plants behind or in front of the cemeteries. So this is common. It just shows you how closely communities are living to what's being produced in these companies. So I think that this is the reality of it all. I really think the transparency of chemicals is so important in the process because we're also facing climate issues, and we're seeing ever increasing hurricanes and ever increasing weather events. So now, in addition to that, we have these chemicals being pumped out. We have really bad circumstances or natural disasters happening, and we have in many cases, we don't know exactly what's coming out of the plants. Okay, next, please. Yeah, I want to just show you, if you wouldn't mind, this is a flare that's going at one of the refineries or one of the plants we have in St. Charles Parish. And this was a good night because there was only one going. This is usually there can be as much as 5 flares going at one time. And this is just not uncommon. You can see actually as you fly over into New Orleans, you can actually see the flares going off. And keep in mind, these are around the chemical plants. These are very close to communities. So you can smell the chemicals, you can taste the chemicals. It's in the air. It's a real problem and it's causing real issues. I also have some figures. I pulled these figures. I'm not going to say what plant it came from, but this came off of their press release. Okay, so this is what one plant produces, and this is the information that they self-reported, which was ethylene 3.33 billion pounds a year, propylene 1.44 billion pounds a year, butadiene 0.35 billion pounds a year, and the feedstocks 0.84 billion pounds a year. That's one refinery that's producing this. So one plant that's producing this. Remember, there's 140 within our area, within the river parishes. Okay, and what we're asking for is we need an absolute severe. We need I don't want to say severe. We really need strong intervention. Because we hear a lot of recycling. Recycling will not help communities like mine that are on an upstream. It will not change what's coming out of these plants. We hear about microplastics as one big. Our communities are getting plastic even smaller than microplastics because we're getting it pumped out of the refineries. So the talk about recycling and the energy that's being used to figure out a recycling method is not really going to help communities like mine throughout the country who are facing throughout the world, who have this in their backyards and their front yards. And again, recycling, we have to come. It does not work. The reason why we're here, we cannot recycle our way out of this problem. We cannot recycle our way out of the toxic material that is impacting our communities. And so we're asking for reduce, reuse, and repair, and using non-plastic alternatives. single-use plastic and multiple-use plastic is still produced the same way. So communities on the front line will always have the impact of the plastic. And what I'm afraid of is as we return to these solutions, we're still facing it. Our communities will still be the sacrifice zones. We started off in many cases as a sacrifice zones when we talk about slavery. We were sacrificed, many of our ancestors, because of economy. And we don't want this to keep happening to our communities. And this lastly, what I will end on is that we cannot have this conversation without environmental justice being part of the conversation. And we must consider whenever we have solutions, whose community will be impacted by the solution. Because a solution for one is not a solution for everybody, and the communities need to be engaged in these conversations. So I just want to thank you. Here's a picture of the EJ delegation that I went to Paris with for the INC-2 treaty talks, and I really appreciate the amazing, incredible information that I heard today, and also having the time to speak with you today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. We really appreciate that. And just to echo the comment from Paula Chin in the chat box, thank you so much, Joe. Love your passion on the issue and for making it a human issue. It's really inspiring, people before profit. So thank you. That was a wonderful ending note. And with that, I'll hand it back to OPLN founder Dave Ford. Take it home.
So thank you, Heather. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you to SAP and Accenture, our supporting partners, for making this possible. We are on a journey together. We are not quite halfway there, depending on how these INCs continue to progress. But we hope that today was informative, that you learned some things, maybe from some of the speakers that you didn't understand their perspective. The idea is to help us all learn from each other so that we can move faster. We will be doing pre and post INC-3 programming to help understand what's coming at INC-3, and then again another digest after. We are really deeply involved with all the different groups that are involved with this, and I think on behalf of the OPLN team, Marta, Heather, Olivia, myself, we're just so grateful for all of you coming today, and have an amazing. We also are going to make this available on recording, and we hope and encourage that you can share it out with folks on your teams that maybe were not able to join. Have a great day, and thank you so much.